everybody. This is Off the Cuff, and I'm your host, Dr. Michael Lynch. And I want to thank you for watching. We've got a pretty good show tonight, and it's one of the strange, more fascinating things that I have not heard a lot of people talk about in the paranormal, so I thought I'd just kind of bring it in for you, kind of reel it in and see what this is all about. It is on my bucket list. So if I get a chance, I will get out and see this thing, which everybody else has seen, I guess, or has at least talked about it. They've talked about it with me a couple of times, but I have not had a chance to be there. So let's kind of begin in the beginning and see where this goes. So, as we all know, or at least most of us knows, about 437,000 years ago, a group of individuals called the Anunnaki arrived in the upper basin, Mesopotamia basin. And they set up a colony there to start mining gold. You'll find that in the first chapters of Genesis, where they talk about gold and finding great gold and onyx long before mankind was actually created. So the Anunnaki put it in a base, they started mining gold, they put in irrigations, they developed human beings so they could be a workforce, and they also went around the world. Now there is a list, a king's list, that reigned in Mesopotamia. And those kings were, you might say, the bosses, the captains of industry and their ships, and they stayed in basically Mesopotamia. That is what primarily the king's list is. It's the order of leaders. So, but that is not all that there was. There was enough Anunnaki and enough humans at the time where they could spread out and go all over the globe. And they did. So they went from area to area to find more gold, as much as they possibly could. Some actually suggest they went to Michigan and mined for copper as well. Now this is a two-phase scenario. Some people say it was the Atlanteans or around that time period. Some people say it was later. And the copper from Michigan was mined and resourced out to start the Bronze Age in Europe, because there was not enough copper and barely enough tin to create the Bronze Age. So that's neither here nor there. What we're talking about today is the Anunnaki and their quest and thirst for gold. They had ships in orbit, and the gold that was mined went up and down, back and forth, making deliveries and things like that. So there was a full-time, workforce digging, mining the gold, and somewhat refining it, you might say, melting it down, making ingots, and these ingots were then shipped out into upper orbit. Now, there have been several controversial ideas about the Anunnaki and why doesn't their civilization actually hang around? Why haven't we found more than just the Mesopotamian, the Syrian king's list and the order of the cities as they were being built? Because that is a primarily stagnated function. It's primarily right there all the time. So, but this time we're going to go beyond that. And some of the Anunnaki went to areas around the world, Brazil, Africa, and America, and they established forts and bases, which were basically mining and refining colonies. And they started out with about 7,000 to 10,000 workers, human workers, at each area. And they were broken down into mining, refining, and then shipping it out. And the ships would come and go and ship it out as quantities built up. So there has been some theory that there should be an Anunnaki civilization's remains, such as buildings or walls or something, that should be left over from 437,000 years ago, which is a long time ago in the human condition, because our kind of history kind of was, whatever our history restarted itself, it was about 6,000 years ago. So you have 6,000 years, 437,000 years. Long time, big space in between. Now, the Anunnaki needed gold for their planet and the atmosphere that encased their planet, and they were injecting gold into their atmosphere in order to keep it warm. So there was this cloud of gold that was floating around their upper atmosphere just to keep their planet warm. Well, that's the story that they tell. Who knows? They could have been down at Las Vegas gambling it all away long before Las Vegas even actually existed. But neither here nor there. So the ancient astronaut theory is the search for, or the idea that the Anunnaki had bases, and where were they, and what did they consist of, and things like that. Now, the problem is that 437,000 years ago was a very long time. The Earth has rebooted itself several times, and even during the Anunnaki's reign, it rebooted itself, and they left. In the King's List, it actually states, and the flood came, and they left. And then it says, and then they returned back to Earth at a later date. And then started the kingships all over, rebuilding their neck of the woods. And really, that neck of the woods is really what we have today as what we call the Anunnaki setup. But because other colonies were developed because of the resource of mining gold, they might have remnants of lying around, depending on the size, stature, and shape of those colonies, and when they approximately were developed and designed. So if you're in a civilized environment, you may not have any walls around your city at all. If you're in a hostile environment, you may build large walls around the city to prevent from attack or predators, wild animals, dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, that would invade your city and then eat your food and things like that. There is an area in Minnesota, just 30 minutes north of Montana, not Minnesota. Montana, just 30 minutes north of Billings, Montana, is called the Sage Wall. And in other areas in that same state, they call the Giants Playground. The Giants Playground, the Sage Wall, and a couple of other monolithic structures. Now, there's a young lady by the name of Julie Ryder, and she claims that these are Cyclopean structures. Okay, Cyclopean structures, and that they must have been there prior to the last ice age, but they've been destroyed by a massive flood or being covered in mud and ilk and things like that. So she doesn't really have a date for them, but she puts them back prior to the ice age, which is roughly, a good idea. I know there's several people who have made the attempts. Other scientists have claimed that the Sage Wall and its surroundings are just a natural artifact of erosion and development in that area. So you would have a wall, you would have a mountain, it would break down, be covered with mud, and the remnants would be there. But, this is a big but, Julie Ryder has found polymorphic stone covering the outsides of these walls. Now, in the Giants Playground, you'll see more of it. And they say that this stone is technically granite, but that granite is not really found anywhere else around that area. It's only concentrated within almost a mile radius of those walls and of those structures. So if they were going to mine it, they didn't have to drag it very far to install it. Or did they pulverize the stone and then design it and make it so that you could build on top of it, build it in layers, stones in layers, and develop an entire wall? Now we see this at Sacsayhuaman and in other areas of Peru where they have this polymorphic stone, especially at Pumapunco. Pumapunco is nothing but polymorphic stone poured like a concrete into a mold, compressed or heated up, and then it develops entire brick. So, but that was done by the Orions. So the Pumapunco, Sacsayhuaman, and the Great Pyramids of Egypt were all done by the Orions when they came. But prior to that, there was another technology, a technology that dealt with megalithic architecture and walls and stones, predating all other civilizations, Stonehenge, Egypt. It goes on and on. So the dolmens of France are the similar size and shape and weight and tonnage that you would see in the Sage Wall, or at the Sage Wall, or the Giants Playgrounds in Montana. So there's an interesting correlation there because, one, the south of France dolmens have not been destroyed. They're still there. I've been there. I've seen them. But the ones in Montana have been destroyed. So we have totally two different time periods, similar ideas, similar weight and construction of the environment. But the difference is, one is polymorphic coating on the outside of the stone. The other ones are just stone, because I've seen them. I've been to south of France. I've been to the middle of France, and I've been around these dolmens. I went to Karnak. I saw the stones there. They were not covered with polymorphic coatings. Okay, so the Sage Wall and the Giant's Playground have polymorphic coverings which covered the stone for its protection. And also the stone was put together, okay? The stone was probably cut or put together in a way that was earthquake proof. And we don't see this again until Malta. Some of the constructions in Malta are earthquake proof, so if they're rocking and rolling, they don't fall down. And you'll see this at the Sage Wall and the Giant's Playground. Here's the other thing too. Now, Julie Ryder talks about sound waves and maybe some of the stones were lifted by sound and things like that. I disagree. It was hard, back-breaking work that did this. The original walls that were there at the Sage Wall were 250 feet tall. They were over 20 or 30 feet thick. And the reason for this was to keep the dinosaurs out, if not more, animals of that time period. So you have 437,000 years ago, and then you have 12,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago. So you're up against different things in the environment. It was not a safe environment. America was not safe. It was a wild ride of different animals and different problems, and a lot of it could have been under the snow and ice, depending on how fast everything started to melt. Now again, this was 400,000 years ago, so we don't even understand or know what the geopolitical situation was at that time. There could have been some humans here. There could have been nothing but animals here. Unknown. But we do know that the Sage Wall was 250 feet tall. It was built by human labor, by the Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki were there for what? Gold. And they built over 20 different sites in that area. And they were mining or sifting, what we call sifting for gold. They were going to be there long enough to build these constructions. So if you have 7,000 people, you have to feed, house, clothe, and put them to work looking for gold. Now, they didn't do mines as we understand mines. They just dug down and did surface mining, where they would, just find the gold that was on the surface, and then they could expand. So once they expanded, they formulated 20 other settlements or bases to do the same thing, do surface mining for gold. They didn't even really go down to the bedrock. But what they did and what was left behind after the deluge, after the destruction, was this structure. Now, the reason why it was abandoned is because they got most of the gold that was actually there. So in the gold rush, where everybody had gold in California and Alaska, all the gold rushes were put together because that was a quick way to make a fortune. Here in Montana, they had water for sluicing, they had the stone for building, and they could do irrigation. And you see next to the Sage Wall a gulch. They call it a gulch. And this gulch was a large active river. So they could do a lot of things right there next to the Sage Wall, the enclosure, and also next to the Giants Playground, because why? Everything was there. Water, sunshine, land, and gold. So in the development of all this, Julie Ryder, in one of her videos, actually has a piece of polymorphic stone. A polymorphic stone that has fallen off or cracked and fallen off of the Sage Walls. And she has another one that she explains at the Giants Playground. Now, this is the same polymorphic stone and arrangement and consistency as Sacsayhuaman. Sacsayhuaman actually is a little thicker and looks like stone, but it's really polymorphic concrete made from the same stone. So they take granite, pulverize it down to where it's just like a powder, an aggregate, and then they start mixing other compositions with it, and then they cover it. The reason why the stones are designed that way, so they don't fall in and they don't fall out, and they do fracture cracks, so that they are coupled with no mortar. And if they did shift, they wouldn't crack the polymorphic covering. There's another video by another gentleman, I forget his name right now, but he and his friend were climbing around the Sage Wall, and one of them said, "Look, that looks like concrete between, or a mortar, dried mortar powder, between the stones." Julie Ryder actually says that the base stones are cut in a cup-like design. Okay, well, if you look at that, that's totally logical, because you want the wall to rotate if there was an earthquake, but you don't want it to be pushed over by a mastodon or Tyrannosaurus Rex or Brontosaurus. You want it to be flexible in its motion, but yet solid in its construction. And that's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. It's very, very difficult to do. So they mined, they built, they mined, and they settled there for quite some time until the gold was relatively exhausted. When the West was being harvested, colonized, where they were running out and digging up gold, we see the same compulsion as they did in a micro form. So people got into wagons, they got their horses, they got their buggies, they got mom and pa kettle, and they went out west and they set up tent communities, and they went and panned for gold. Then they refined it. We emulated and copied the same procedures, except it took us years to develop permanent civilizations, permanent structures. And the only people that got wealthy out of that exploration of the American manifest destiny, the expansion, were the people who were selling the items, the shovels, the sluices, the wagons, the kerosene for your lanterns, all that. Those guys made the most amount of money. But the miners, they actually mined it, really just about broke even. Not unless they homesteaded the land, which a lot of them did, and they did homestead a large sum of acreage. And that acreage is where they settled and grew crops, had cattle, performed a lot of things that farmers do. But gold mining was foremost on the list. And every time you have a gold rush, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in Bolivia, whether it's in America or any other place, if people talk about it and it gets out, you'll have thousands and thousands, you'll have hordes of people going to that area to mine for gold. Whether they do it on a simple level or an extremely complex level, they still go for the gold. They're going for the gold. It's embedded in our society today, just like the Anunnaki embedded their desire, quest for gold, as Western civilization did. The conquistadors, the explorers of America, they were all interested not in the land and not in the indigenous people that were here. They were only here for the gold, to exploit it and then take it back west where they could refine it, put it into coins. Now, it actually got to a point with Spain that when they found the gold here in America, they melted it down and they made coins out of it. Coins of the realm, coins of the king. So when people said, oh, whose gold is that? They would say, that is the Spanish king. And then they would take it back to Spain. So the king would just be receiving his own money, which was really harvested from South America. So the quest and lust for gold dates back over 400,000 years. And we are still doing it today. There's guys in Alaska, they are doing it today in Alaska 24/7, as long as the season does permit. So the quest for gold is built into as far back as we can possibly remember. Rome, on the verge of going bankrupt, Rome melted down all the gold statues in the Colosseum, or the arena. They were gold statues in each window of the arena. And we call it the Colosseum today, but that's a misnomer. The Colosseum, or was called Colosseum, was called after a colossus, the colossus of a god that was there. It was not really a god, it was one of the Caesars, and it was called the Colossus, and the building next to it was also called the Colosseum. But we call it today the arena. And then that's where, the notorious games were played. So anyway, getting back to all this, ancient aliens are always chasing the concept and ideas of ancient civilizations, ancient astronauts. The idea is to get ahead of that as far as we can. And if you follow the King's List and do the demarcation of the flood, okay, and you point it in all the right directions, you'll end up at a wall in Montana, just north of Billings. And we call it the Sage Wall. Also visit the Giants Playground, and you might get a tour. It's on private property, and they do charge to get on, about $40 per person. So it's not inexpensive, but you can stay all day, have a lunch. They do have Airbnbs nearby. You can stay for the weekend, investigate the whole thing, and just think for a moment, if you could dig down deep enough, you could find the remnants of the original Anunnaki and their settlement, buried under thousands of years of restarting, rebooting, and turmoil. So people talk about the Younger Dryas. It is my assumption, my hypothesis, that if you dig down deep enough, you would actually see burned charcoal marks on the base or next to the base of the Sage Wall to mark the idea of the Younger Dryas period. And that was only 12,000 years ago, how many driest periods or collapses the world has gone through in 400,000 years. Anyway, that's the show. I'm glad you tuned in. And this is Off the Cuff, and I've been your host, Michael Lynch. Tune in next time for something fascinating.